Operation Outward was a unique British World War II program that called for free-flying balloons to disrupt German communications, power lines, and other critical objectives. Despite its unconventional nature and practicality, the operation was a tremendous success. Some balloons were filled with trailing steel wire intended to damage high-voltage power lines by producing short circuits, while others were filled with explosive devices to start unexpected fires in German forests and fields. The plan was not just cost-effective, amounting to less than $8 per balloon in 1942 currency, around $140 in today's, but also practical, as there would be no friendly casualties. More than 100,000 outward balloons were launched between 1942 and 1944. At one point during the war, over 1,800 balloons were being sent into Germany in a matter of hours. According to post-war data, it is estimated that damage caused by the unlikely weapons amounted to around $55 million in today's currency. That was a lot of havoc coming from cheap, ordinary balloons. World War I. In his article, When Britain Flew Balloon Bombs to Germany in World War II, author Karthik Nambi wrote, quote, "Balloons were first used for meteorological purposes. Instruments to measure humidity, temperature, and other data were loaded onto a balloon and lifted to a certain height to measure the weather data." But by World War I, balloons were employed by several armies to detect enemy positions, drop bombs, or disorient enemy aircraft. Reconnaissance balloons carried one or more observers equipped with binoculars, maps, and a telephone line connected to the base to relay enemy positions. The crew would draw and take notes of pivotal ammunition depots, barracks, and other valuable military objectives. However, they were highly vulnerable to enemy ground fire because of low speeds and next to no armor. These balloons were eventually replaced by warplanes fitted with special cameras to capture the battlefields. Other types of balloons, such as the German Zeppelins, were used for attack purposes. These balloons were employed to drop bombs on enemy positions, carry valuables, and sabotage enemy radio broadcasts. At the same time, their massive size made them somewhat resistant to long-range enemy fire. Another variation was the barrage balloons, employed as defense mechanisms. Germany, France, Britain, and Italy used them to lift barrage nets around specific locations. A steel cable would be strung between the balloons with several wires hanging from it. The nets would then be raised to an altitude of up to 4,500 meters, the approximate operational ceiling of bombers from the time. Months before World War I ended, London was protected by a barrage balloon defense line that stretched for about 80 kilometers. German pilots would need to be on a constant lookout to avoid getting caught with the steel nets. Self-damage weapons. In 1936, the British Air Ministry began producing barrage balloons once again, as a cautionary measure in case of another war against Germany. The following year, the Air Ministry ordered a study to determine how much harm a balloon could cause if accidentally set free from a fixed position and left to wander around the local countryside with its steel cables. They would also analyze the amount of time it took technicians to repair the damage while people were left without electricity. Preliminary results indicated that if the steel cables came upon power lines, electricity supplies could be out for around 6 hours. But the British intelligence shelved the study until World War II broke out. In early 1940, just before France crumbled to the Blitzkrieg, the British Air Vice Marshal of the Balloon Command wrote to the Admiralty, quote, "Since the outbreak of the war, I have had constant complaints from the electricity distributors regarding the damage done in this country by barrage balloons that have broken away from their moorings." The Air Vice Marshal also suggested that the balloons could be weaponized against the enemy. By then, several British officers were already making preparations to launch bomb-laden balloons from France, but were unsure if they would work and afraid of local damage. Still, barrage balloons were employed by the British to halt German fighters and bombers during the Battle of Britain in 1940. The tactic successfully damaged more than 100 enemy aircraft. However, during the nights of September 17th and 18th, dangerous storms with gale-force winds let loose numerous barrage balloons that protected English cities from Luftwaffe attacks. The balloons were then carried by winds over to the North Sea and into mainland Europe, where they wreaked havoc with their severed steel cables. Several power outages were reported in cities and towns in Finland, Sweden, and Denmark. One balloon strike even damaged the broadcast tower of the Swedish International Radio Service. Local news reported that the country was being invaded by an army of barrage balloons that covered the coast of Holland, with one reporter describing the sky as lit up with sparks from cables touching electric wires. Days later, on September 19, 1940, Sir Winston Churchill wrote a memo to the War Cabinet that read, quote, "We may make a virtue of our misfortune." Thus, Operation Outward was born. An assortment of balloons. After all the damage caused within Britain and other European cities, the British military decided to use balloons as an offensive weapon against the might of the Wehrmacht. Raoul E. Drapeau, from the Energy magazine's history column, wrote that Operation Outward was, quote, an offensive weapon scheme that the British hoped would carry the battle to Germany and the occupied countries less expensively and more safely than British night bomber attacks. The Britons believed that balloon attacks would prove highly expensive for the Germans to defend against. The balloons would fly at such high altitudes that even during the daytime, Germany would need to spend precious fuel and fighter aircraft that could be used elsewhere rather than taking down balloons. The Admiralty envisioned several types of balloons. The two most common carried either steel wires or explosive materials to provoke fires in the German countryside. The balloons were about 2.4 meters in diameter when inflated. They were filled with hydrogen and had a loose cord inside. One end led to a spring-loaded valve, and the other was secured at the desired cruising altitude length, which was about 7,000 meters. According to Raoul Drapeau, quote, when the balloon reached its planned cruising altitude, it had enlarged enough from the reduced atmospheric pressure to tighten the internal cord and release some hydrogen from the valve, thereby cutting the lift a little and halting the rise in altitude. The balloon's fuse was then lit after a determined number of hours. As it began to descend, the fuse would burn through a cord holding the wire, dropping it beneath the balloon. The trailing wire was 200 meters long and 1.6 millimeters in diameter. The British believed that the wire could be dragged 50 kilometers into the German countryside, eventually encountering a high-voltage transmission line. The other ordnance carried by the balloons was of incendiary nature. They were called beer, jelly, and socks. Beer balloons consisted of a metallic bottle with self-igniting phosphorus. Upon contact with the ground, they instantly ignited. Jelly balloons were cans of incendiary jelly. When activated, a fireball with a radius of 6 meters erupted in the ground. Socks were 3 long canvas bags carried by a balloon. They contained an assortment of materials that could burn for up to 15 minutes. Socks were aimed at trees, and when dropped, they formed a V-shaped sausage. Since the balloons were a dangerous, unguided weapon, the winds had to be in the right direction to carry them eastward into Germany. In addition, the balloons had to be launched at night to reach enemy territory before the Luftwaffe could detect them. Balloon attacks. The first balloon launches happened on March 20th, 1942. The balloons were launched from a Royal Navy establishment near Felixstowe, Suffolk, and another located in Old Stairs Bay near Dover. The majority of the personnel in charge belonged to the Women's Royal Navy Service. Only hours into the first launches, the British Army started receiving messages of forest fires in the German countryside and strange power outages in towns and cities. In July of 1942, a cable-trailing balloon struck a 100,000-volt power line near Leipzig, destroying the Bohlen power station. It became Operation Outward's most significant achievement and cost Germany more than $4 million. By August of 1942, more than 1,000 balloons were being released every day. The German army left the civilians to fight the balloon war, while they concentrated all their manpower on the Eastern Front. Collateral damage was not uncommon. On January 19, 1944, 2 trains at Laholm, Sweden, collided after an outward balloon disrupted the railway's electrical lighting, while other balloons even made their way into Finland. Many outward balloons returned to Britain and knocked out electrical supply in towns located near the coast. As the Allies made their way into France and Germany, Operation Outward slowly decreased its loads. After almost 100,000 balloons launched into Germany, the last ones took off on September 4th, 1944. After the war, a British commission was formed to collect data related to the damage caused by Operation Outward. More than 500 electrical disturbances were registered in German high-voltage 110 kilovolt lines. In France alone, more than 4,000 incidents were recorded. The British Admiralty estimated the total operating cost at a little more than $8.50 per balloon in 1942 currency, while the damage was valued at no less than $60 million. The idea to weaponize the balloons had paid off, and some of them even carried special written messages. One of the most popular being, quote, balls to Hitler, Göring, and Goebbels. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our channels to watch more interesting stories on World War II. And tell us in the comments below what you think about this most unconventional operation.